Hi there, I'm Scott, and this is Great Scott Knitting Dyes Yarn, episode 22. Today I will be dyeing two skeins of Dyer Supplier 7525 Superwash Merino Nylon Fingering Yarn. And I'm going to be doing it with a couple of techniques. One skein of yarn I'm going to basically just kettle dye for a tonal color, and then the second skein I'm going to speckle and see what we get with that. Now, I've done these types of things before. The difference is I'm now going to be using some jacquard acid dyes to do this instead of food coloring. I've never used these in this way, so this will be kind of fun. One skein I am going to be dyeing using jet black, which is a very black, non-breaking black color from jacquard. But I don't want a black skein of yarn. I actually want a gray skein of yarn. But to be able to do that, I'm going to have to do some calculations as to how much dye to use to get a gray. The second skein of yarn I'm actually going to speckle with just direct dye powder. So I've never done that before, which we'll see how that turns out. And that's going to be relatively easy to do. The challenge is going to be in calculating how much of the jet black dye I'm going to need to dye 100 grams of fiber a light gray. So looking on Google and finding all sorts of websites to tell me about how to calculate dye quantities, here are some basic formulas. So you basically take your weight of fiber, multiply that by the percentage depth of shade that you want, and we'll talk a little bit more about depth of shade. And then you divide that by 100, and that gives you how many grams you need for that depth of shade. So DOS is what is used for that. So I'm going to be dyeing 100 grams, and at 1% depth per shade, or as at a 1, that would make 1 gram of dye. And when you dissolve 1 gram of dye in 100 milliliters of water, that's what we call a 1% stock solution. And that's what a lot of dyers use as a basis for the standard color of a particular dye that they have. So basic calculations to then reduce that amount down to less dye per 100 grams will give you a different percentage depth of shade. So 1% would be jet black. 0.5% or half of that would a 0.5% depth of shade would be probably still black, but just less intense. 0.25% were probably a dark gray. 0.125 probably a medium gray, and 0.0625 a light gray. So a half, a quarter, an eighth, and a 16th of depth of shade. If you do that in measurements of the quantity of your 1% stock solution, so if you only had 100 milliliters of your 1% stock solution, you do use all of that on 100 grams of fiber. But then to get those depth of shades, you use less. So if you wanted the very lightest, you'd only use 6 milliliters of that stock solution on that 100 grams, and that would give you that color of a very light gray. Or the other way you could do that is you could if you only wanted to make a 0.06% stock solution, then you measure out 0.06 grams of dye. So there's two ways you could go about it. Measuring the 0.06 grams of dye is harder than creating a 1% stock solution and measuring out 6 milliliters. That's the easy way. Guess which way I went? So I do have my first 100 grams of yarn soaking in just plain tap water. And yeah, so that's where I am. So we're going to move forward and we're going to look at dyeing this first skein. So I am going to show you how I kind of started with measuring my dye. So here's my jet black, and I have these very, very tiny measuring spoons that will allow me to sort of measure this out. So instead of measuring out a full gram and then creating a 1% stock solution that I then measure out the 6 milliliters, I chose to go with the 0.06 grams of dye, thinking that I was saving myself somehow. It's much harder. Needless to say, I did create my 0.06% stock solution, and I'm going to add that to my water, which has about 1 tablespoon of citric acid in it. So it's a nicely acidic bath to which I've added my dye. And now I'm going to take my pre-soaked skein of yarn and add that in. So here's my yarn, and we're going to add that in. You can kind of see how nice and light that is. Even though the dye in the pot looks like it's black, when you get the skein of yarn in there, you can see how light that color is. I'm really liking this. This is pretty. So I'm going to let this absorb. And wow, actually, when you look at it, it looks like it's absorbing that dye very quickly already. So I'm going to let this steep for a while, for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll come back and see what it looks like. So this is about 15 minutes later. And definitely a clear pot. And as I kind of thought might happen, the skein of yarn is lighter than what I really want it to wind up being. So I am going to go ahead and, although it's very pretty, I really like it, I'm going to pull this off, and I am going to add in another 0.06% stock solution. So basically another 0.06 grams of dye. And add just that much more color again. So technically this skein is being dyed at a 0.12% depth of shade. So an eighth of the color. And because it was a bit more tonal than I wanted, I'm going to kind of move it around a little bit to make sure that it picks up a lot of color throughout. It's still going to be tonal, but I do want to kind of even out some of that color. So now I'll let this steep for another 15 minutes. We'll come back and take a look at the final project. And I can see that the dye bath is fully exhausted. And I like the color now. It's not quite so light, but it's certainly just a nice silvery gray. It will dye, or it will dry up maybe a little bit lighter, but I just love that color. It's just absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to rinse this and hang it to dry, and we will then check the final results a little bit later. And now to my speckling. Wearing a respirator mask and a pre-soaked skein of yarn that was soaking in some citric acid water. I am going to use a small sieve, and I'm going to speckle this skein of yarn. So here we go. And I'm just going to tap on the side and begin this process. Now I am going to use this bright yellow. I'm going to also use fire red and brilliant blue and jet black on this skein of yarn. So those are the colors that I'm going to be coming in with. And so here's the fire red. And I'm just going to speckle this around the entire skein. And now we will take a look at the brilliant blue, which I have added off camera. And I think I've also turned it off camera. So we're looking at the back side. And I'm going to finish things up and wrap the skein, steam it, and rinse it once it's fully cooled. So I'm just going to finish up a little here. Then I will wrap it in this plastic wrap, pop it into a steamer basket, and then we'll see how it finally turns out. What are you doing? All right, so after all of my skeins of yarn have been rinsed, dried, and now we're going to look at those final results. We'll start off with our Gray Day scale or skein of yarn. A really lovely tonal gray, sort of silvery color. I really love how this turned out. And the nice thing is I could easily repeat this process and the amount of dye that I used because it was very precise. So that is one thing about doing calculations and doing things from a precision point of view, is that you can write it down, you know exactly what the formula is, you can do it again. It turns, it looks really great twisted up as well. Now, with my Crayola Chaos is what I'm calling it, things turned out a little differently. I did steam it and hang it to dry. Steam it, I let it cool, rinsed it, hung it to dry, and it was decidedly uneven. And so off camera, I tried to correct that unevenness by re-soaking it, re-speckling it. And I found that it did want to bleed quite a bit. So I threw it into a pot with some vinegar and water, some vinegar water, and then reset it. But in a pot, because of the speckling and because of the bleeding, the black especially sort of ran, and it toned everything way down. But I thought I'd ruined it. I thought it just looked terrible to begin with. But I actually really like it now. It's not what I was going for. It is the speckles that I used were much heavier than really what I had in my mind. I don't know what I was thinking. What I had in my mind was lighter amounts of color, not total saturation of color. But it turned out well. Anyway, it's still pretty, even though it's not quite what I had envisioned. Skeined up, it looks lovely as well. But it does kind of look like a Crayola box exploded on my yarn. So I'm calling it Crayola Chaos. But you know what? It was a learning experience. So some things that I think for myself that I have learned from these two skeins of yarn in terms of process. For the first skein, it's much easier to measure out larger amounts of dye. And then once it's diluted into a 1% stock solution, measure out that stock solution to get the lower depths of shade that I am wanting to use. That's number one. For the second skein, I think for the next time I speckle, instead of speckling straight dye powder, I'm going to cut it with some citric acid. So basically take dry citric acid powder and then add small amounts of the dye powder to the citric acid and mix that up. And because then that sort of cuts it down and makes it, number one, the citric acid will help the dye quickly adhere to the yarn, giving me sharper speckles. And it will also help me reduce the amount of dye I'm applying to the yarn. So those are a couple of things I think I'll do for the future. But these two skeins of yarn, I think, do look really lovely. So I am pleased with how they have turned out. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of me dyeing yarn. You can find me on Instagram as GreatScott Knitting. You can find me on Ravelry as GreatScott KCMO. And you can find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page for GreatScott Knitting. You can just do a search to find me there. Or you can also give me a shout out in the comments below. And I love getting your feedback on your thoughts around my dyeing or any of the other content that I place on this channel. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure and click the like button. And if you enjoy what you find on this channel, go ahead and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified of new content. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. May you have peace in your home and the fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Thanks.